Welcome to the Deep Dive Learner. I want you to imagine, just for a second, a single American missile strike. And this strike, which was justified by a blueprint drawn up like 30 years ago, instantly triggers the destruction of 18 U.S. military bases. Oh, and a mass shooting in Austin, Texas.
Yeah, which sounds like the plot of a thriller or something.
Right. But that is not a thriller. That is the horrific reality of the 2026 Middle East conflict. And today, we're opening up the source material to show you the exact, frankly, chilling math behind that entire catastrophe.
We really do have a massive stack of notes to get through today. It primarily centers around this marathon, heavily detailed interview with foreign policy expert Scott Horton. And our mission here is to basically decode the hidden architecture of American foreign policy over, say, the last 3 decades.
Yeah, exactly.
We're looking at how decades of these bipartisan empire-building doctrines have essentially manufactured just massive, unintended global blowback.
And look, if you're expecting some dry, political science lecture, think again. We are pulling back the curtain on the hubris, the broken promises, and really the staggering financial and human costs of trying to control the globe.
Absolutely.
Because before we can even begin to understand the crises dominating the news today, we have to look at the rule book Washington has been operating from since the end of the Cold War. So, okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is this blueprint?
Well, so it starts in 1992 with something called the Wolfowitz Doctrine.
Okay.
Paul Wolfowitz was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the time, and the explicit stated goal of his post-Cold War plan was just staggering. I mean, the idea was that the United States must remain the dominant power on every single continent.
Every continent.
Every continent?
Yeah.
But it goes deeper than just being, a major player. The doctrine dictates that the U.S. must be so overwhelmingly dominant that it actively prevents any rival nation from even trying to balance against American power.
So it's like an explicit demand for permanent global hegemony. You essentially tell the rest of the world, don't even think about catching up.
Exactly.
And then just a few years later, in 1996, we see that broad global philosophy applied specifically to the Middle East. Right? The source is called this the Clean Break paper.
Right, the Clean Break. It was drafted by a group of American neoconservatives for Benjamin Netanyahu during his first term as Israel's prime minister.
Okay.
And the core argument was this massive shift in strategy. It advocated for entirely abandoning the idea of compromise or, like, the Oslo peace process. Instead, the authors argued for peace through absolute total dominance over all neighboring states.
So you don't negotiate. You just dictate.
You dictate, period.
Which perfectly frames the disastrously flawed logic behind the 2003 Iraq War. Because the architects of that war, they didn't just want to remove Saddam Hussein for the sake of it.
No, they genuinely believed they were engineering this grand regional realignment.
Right. Their theory, according to the sources, was that if you violently overthrow Saddam, you somehow magically create this compliant pro-Western Shiite government in Iraq.
Yeah.
And that newly minted government would then theoretically force Hezbollah in Lebanon to abandon its alliance with Iran and suddenly ally with Israel.
Which is what's fascinating here is how this clean break mentality treats human societies like simple, sterile math equations.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, the hubris is staggering. The policymakers sitting in Washington thought they could just delete a variable Saddam Hussein, and the equation would perfectly balance out in their favor. It completely ignores historical grievances, religious complexities, tribal realities, all of it.
It's like watching someone play a terrible game of Risk.
Oh, totally.
They spend, what, $5 to $10 trillion trying to flip the entire board, assuming the little plastic pieces will just magically land exactly where they want them to. But real geopolitics isn't plastic pieces. It's a chessboard where the pieces have their own historical grudges and, they move themselves the moment you look away.
And that is precisely why the exact opposite of their plan happened. But removing Saddam, who was, a Sunni leader ruling a majority Shiite country, the U.S. inevitably paved the way for Shiite majority rule in Iraq.
Right.
And who is the ultimate Shiite power in the region? Iran. So the U.S. didn't weaken Iranian influence at all. They essentially handed Iraq over to Iranian influence on a silver platter.
Wow.
They took the Sunni roadblock out of the way and empowered Iran more than ever before.
Which is wild. But that clean break illusion, the idea that you can just violently delete a variable and the geopolitical math works out, that wasn't just reserved for adversaries in the Middle East.
No, not at all.
Washington applied that exact same hubris to a crumbling nuclear superpower in Eastern Europe, which, set the stage for the catastrophe we saw unfold in Ukraine.
Yeah, to understand the mechanics of that, we really have to look at a fundamental broken promise.
Okay.
Back in 1989 in Malta, George H.W. Bush promised Mikhail Gorbachev that if the Soviets let the Warsaw Pact states in Eastern Europe go, the U.S. would not expand NATO eastward.
But the U.S. did expand it repeatedly.
Repeatedly.
And the source material highlights just how proactive and documented this provocation became. Because if you fast forward to 2019, there's this study published by the RAND Corporation, which is a Pentagon-sponsored think tank.
Right?
And the report is literally titled, Extending Russia.
Yeah, and the word extending in this context means overextending.
Okay, right.
It was a literal published playbook on how to agitate and drain Russia by meddling in places like Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Syria, and, of course, by massively increasing support for the Ukrainian military.
So the goal wasn't peace.
No, the explicit goal wasn't to create stability. It was to bog Russia down with military expenses and geopolitical commitments they simply couldn't afford.
Okay, wait, I need to push back here. Because the standard counter-argument we always hear is that if the U.S. doesn't keep Russia or China aggressively checked, they'll just expand and take over their neighbors anyway.
Sure, that's the narrative.
Right, the logic is, if you don't push them, they push you. So why does the source material frame this as a dangerous provocation rather than, just necessary defense?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at the underlying mechanism driving these decisions. The sources point to something called public choice theory.
Okay, what is that?
It's an economic concept applied to politics. It essentially suggests that politicians are not idealized public servants working for the long-term national interest.
Shocker.
Right. They are rational actors maximizing their own short-term utility, meaning votes, funding, and domestic political wins.
Ah, so you're saying the strategy isn't always about grand global security. It's about what looks good on a campaign flyer back home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Consider the admission from Strobe Talbott, a key figure in the Clinton administration. He originally opposed NATO expansion because he knew it was an unnecessary provocation against a post-Soviet Russia.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, but he later championed it. And why? The source material explicitly calls out the domestic drivers. It was about securing massive defense contracts for companies like Lockheed Martin and securing Polish-American votes in swing states like Illinois for the 1996 election.
Wow.
They chose the short-term political win over the long-term higher interest of actually integrating a post-Cold War Russia into the global community.
That makes the rhetoric used by politicians later on sound incredibly cynical. I mean, the sources mentioned politicians bragging about the strategy in Ukraine using what is hilariously but darkly termed the underpants gnome strategy.
Right, from the show South Park.
Yeah.
Step 1, steal underpants. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, profit.
Yes, but applied to global warfare. So it's like step 1, send billions of dollars to kill Russians. Step 2, blank. Step 3, strategic victory. You literally had U.S. politicians openly bragging to the press about getting a good bang for their buck because Russian soldiers were dying and American soldiers weren't.
Which is an incredibly grim way to view foreign policy.
Completely.
It completely ignores the horrific society-level destruction of Ukraine and its people. It treats an allied nation as just a disposable tool for inflicting financial costs on a rival.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because while Washington is playing this aggressive global chess game, constantly trying to overextend everyone else, they have massive, glaring vulnerabilities of their own.
Massive blind spots.
Right. Vulnerabilities that all the money in the world cannot easily fix.
We're talking about the illusion of total control, specifically regarding the supply chain for advanced microchips.
Yes. The United States relies almost entirely on Taiwan for advanced semiconductors. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, they produce over half the world's advanced semiconductors and roughly 90% of the most cutting-edge nodes.
Right.
We are talking about the tiny microscopic brains that power everything from your smartphone to, like, the most advanced military hardware on Earth.
And the assumption in Washington, which is driven by that exact same hubris we've been discussing, is often, well, we have a $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. If the supply chain in Taiwan is threatened, we'll just throw money at Austin, Texas, and build a chip factory there.
But you cannot just throw money at this problem. I mean, making a cutting-edge node, getting transistors down to 3 nanometers means dealing with literal atomic level physics.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
It's like looking at an ancient highly specialized rainforest ecosystem and saying, I'll just plant a tree in my backyard and I'll have a rainforest tomorrow. It does not work that way.
No.
Taiwan built this ecosystem over decades.
Exactly. It requires a dense clustering of highly specialized suppliers who all operate within miles of each other. It requires a massive generational pool of dedicated engineering talent.
Yeah.
And it requires tens of billions of dollars to build a single fabrication plant, which then has to run at near full capacity constantly just to be profitable. You can't just transplant that overnight.
So the profound irony here is almost unbelievable. You have an American empire attempting to project absolute military dominance globally, agitating rivals in Europe and the Middle East, yet it remains fundamentally tethered to and entirely dependent on one tiny island for its most critical technological infrastructure.
It's a staggering blind spot.
Absolutely.
Which brings us directly to the devastating climax of these policies, the 2026 conflict with Iran.
Right.
This is the moment when the bluff of total global dominance, the clean break mentality, and the ignorance of these massive vulnerabilities all just collide in a single catastrophic event.
So how did we get to that specific breaking point in 2026?
Well, it comes back to the influence of Benjamin Netanyahu on Donald Trump. For years, the U.S. and Iran had existed in a tense but, manageable standoff, a mutual deterrence. But the clean break doctrine demands total dominance, not deterrence. Netanyahu convinced Trump to abandon that standoff, falsely equating Iran's civilian nuclear program with an active, immediate weapons program.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Because the narrative we always hear in the news is that Iran was days away from a bomb.
Right.
But looking at these notes detailing the International Atomic Energy Agency reports, Iran had literally poured concrete into the core of their Iraq heavy water reactor. Why would a country bent on nuclear Armageddon sabotage its own plutonium harvesting capabilities?
Because they weren't building a bomb.
Wow. Okay.
To understand the mechanics of this, you have to look at the nuclear fuel cycle.
Yeah.
You mine uranium, you mill it, you convert it into a gas, and then you spin it in centrifuges to enrich it.
Right, the spinning.
Exactly. Now, for civilian nuclear power, you only need to enrich uranium to about 3 to 5% purity. To build a standard nuclear weapon, you generally need uranium enriched to about 90% purity, specifically the isotope U-235.
And Iran was not producing 90% purity.
They were not. They had mastered the fuel cycle, meaning they had the knowledge and the centrifuges to enrich it to 90% if they chose to, but they deliberately stopped short. They maintained what experts call a latent deterrent. It was a political lever to maintain leverage in negotiations. It was not an active, immediate bomb-making operation.
But again, the clean break blueprint doesn't allow for nuance or latent deterrence. It demands unilateral submission.
Exactly.
So the U.S. launches a horrific preemptive strike. And the details here from the sources are just incredibly grim. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. The U.S. military used experimental Lockheed missiles that fired tungsten pellets before detonation to maximize casualties.
Yes, the goal was massive, overwhelming destruction to force immediate capitulation.
And tragically, one of the targets decimated in the initial wave of that strike was a building containing 2 girls' schools. 167 children were killed in an instant.
It was an absolute atrocity. And what the source material reveals is that the strike was fueled in part by a terrifying religious fanaticism festering inside elements of the U.S. military command.
That's the part that really got me. The sources detail a military commander briefing non-commissioned officers, and he explicitly tells them that President Trump was anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire for Armageddon in Iran.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being a soldier, hearing that? Your commander is quoting the book of Revelation to justify a geopolitical strike that just wiped out a school of children.
It's terrifying. It exposes the deep, irrational undercurrents driving what are supposedly calculated strategic military decisions.
Right.
The think tank analysts in Washington, they write up these sterile papers about extending rivals, but the actual execution on the ground becomes infused with fanaticism and horrific violence. They truly believed that extreme, overwhelming force would result in Iran's immediate capitulation. It was the exact same hubris that drove the Iraq invasion.
But the Iranians didn't back down.
No, they didn't.
They retaliated, and in doing so, they exposed the fragile reality of the U.S. military presence in the Gulf. Iran used its intact, highly capable ballistic missile force to strike 18 separate U.S. bases all the way from Erbil in northern Iraq down to Muscat in Oman.
Yeah.
They destroyed runways, they wiped out multi-million-dollar radar installations, and they essentially proved that The U.S. conventional military empire in the region was a bankrupt bluff.
Which raises a critical question about the mechanics of military posturing, right? Why were those American bases so vulnerable in the first place?
Yeah, why were they?
Well, the military brass had actually warned policymakers for years about Iran's escalation dominance. They knew Iran had spent decades building a massive stockpile of medium-range missiles specifically designed to overwhelm U.S. air defense systems like the Patriot batteries.
Oh, wow.
Those U.S. bases were never structurally meant to fight a full-scale war against Iran.
So, what does this all mean? If the military knew the bases couldn't withstand a barrage, what were the bases actually doing there?
They were designed to be a tripwire, a psychological deterrent.
Okay.
The idea was that Iran wouldn't dare attack its neighbors or U.S. interests because doing so would inevitably hit American troops stationed at these bases, triggering a massive U.S. response. The bases were a geopolitical do not cross this line.
Right.
But because the politicians decided to initiate the conflict anyway, prioritizing short-term posturing over strategic reality, they essentially turned their own tripwire into a row of sitting ducks.
And the blowback wasn't just contained to the Middle East. The source material details what happens when overt, aggressive foreign policy causes immediate, visceral consequences at home, what it terms backdraft terrorism.
You cannot launch a massive violent intervention halfway across the world and expect the consequences to remain neatly confined to a geopolitical chessboard. The violence always echoes back.
Exactly. The very next day after the U.S. strike, an immigrant from Sierra Leone, radicalized by the horrific news of the attack, committed a mass shooting in Austin, Texas. It perfectly encapsulates the utter failure of the clean break mentality. You think you're just adjusting variables on a spreadsheet in Washington, but the reality is blood on the streets in Texas.
The precision we assume exists in foreign policy is largely an illusion. The elegant math equations drawn up by think tanks consistently fail because they refuse to account for human reality. People are not variables. They have memories, they have pride, and they react unpredictably to violence.
If you are listening to this and feeling, completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of these failures, that is completely understandable. The architecture of foreign policy is intentionally dense.
Yeah.
But understanding these mechanisms is the ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed.
Absolutely.
You now know that when you see a conflict erupt on the news, whether it's tension in Eastern Europe, a supply chain panic in the Taiwan Strait, or the devastating 2026 war in the Middle East, it is rarely a sudden, spontaneous eruption. It is almost always the result of decades of rigid doctrines, think tank playbooks, and politicians prioritizing short-term political wins over long-term global stability.
It's the inevitable result of treating the globe like a game board to be dominated rather than a complex ecosystem to be navigated.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought for you to explore on your own. We've seen how politicians consistently wage these wars for short-term political wins, and how they love to brag about zero American casualties when they fight by proxy or, rely on air superiority from miles away.
Right.
But as we move rapidly into an era of artificial intelligence and fully autonomous drone warfare, where literally no American body bags will ever come home to impact poll numbers, will these aggressive clean break doctrines become completely unstoppable? If the voting public doesn't feel the human cost at all, who will be left to hit the brakes?
If the blueprint removes the friction of human consequence, the machine simply continues to build the empire without hesitation.
Until the blueprint, once again, inevitably collides with a messy, tragic reality.